My name is Leonard Atwood, and I am 73 years old. For most of my life I worked as a history teacher in a small high school in Iowa. A quiet man in a quiet profession. Someone who believed that patience and reason were stronger than force. After retiring a decade ago, I thought my life would settle into a gentle rhythm of evenings with my wife Margaret, mornings on the porch with newspapers, and occasional visits from our son Daniel and his family. But Margaret died 7 years ago, and with her passing the balance of my world tipped irreversibly. The house that once echoed with her voice became unbearably silent, each room filled not with comfort, but with the absence of her. I still keep her favourite teacup on the kitchen shelf, though I never use it, and the cardigan she used to wear on chilly evenings hangs untouched in the hallway closet. People say time softens grief, yet in truth it only rearranges it, pushing it deeper inside where it becomes heavier, less visible, but no less suffocating. Since then, my days have followed a monotonous cycle. I wake early, long before the sun fully rises, not out of necessity, but because sleep has become shallow and nervous. I make coffee, though it never tastes as rich as when Margaret brewed it, and I sit at the table with the local paper spread before me, pretending to read but really staring through the words. Sometimes I try to solve the crossword puzzles, a habit we once shared, but I usually give up halfway, uninterested. The neighbours see me as a polite old man who keeps his yard trimmed and his car clean, someone unremarkable and easy to forget. I cannot say they are wrong. I am unremarkable even to my own family. My son Daniel rarely calls unless he needs something practical, a loan to cover an unexpected expense, help with a car repair, or babysitting when his children were younger. He lives only 30 minutes away, but the distance between us feels immeasurable. When we meet, his tone is always hurried, his eyes already on the clock, as if my presence is a nuisance that interrupts the real life waiting elsewhere. There was a time when Daniel and I were close, when he was a boy who climbed into my lap to hear stories about the Civil War, fascinated by the battles and the great figures of history. I taught him to ride a bicycle, to bait a hook, to look people in the eye when shaking hands. Yet somehow, over the years, respect turned into irritation, and affection turned into detachment. I never understood exactly when the fracture widened. Perhaps it was after Margaret died, when I leaned too heavily on him for companionship, or perhaps it was when he married Julia, a woman with polished manners and a sharp tongue who has never made an effort to hide her disdain for me. To her I am merely the stubborn old man attached to her husband, a man too frugal, too cautious, too slow for their ambitious lifestyle. She speaks to me as if I were a child, correcting my choices at restaurants, reminding me not to forget my cane, telling Daniel in front of me, "Your father doesn't understand how things work these days." Each time she does it, I swallow my pride and remain silent, convincing myself that silence keeps peace. But silence has a cost, and over the years it has hollowed me out. After retirement, I thought family gatherings would become the anchor of my weeks. Instead, holidays became obligations. Thanksgiving invitations were always last minute, my seat at the table positioned at the far end, my words politely ignored. At Christmas I would receive generic gifts, slippers, a sweater in the wrong size, chosen with the absent-mindedness of people ticking boxes on a list. Once I overheard Julia saying to Daniel that buying for me was pointless, since he doesn't use anything new anyway. It was true in a way. I do hold on to old possessions, but not because of stubbornness. Each object carries a memory. The chair where Margaret once knitted, the cracked record player we danced to in our youth. To others they are clutter, but to me they are proof that life once had warmth. I spend much of my time reading. My shelves are lined with history books, biographies, and worn novels I've read 3 times already. I mark passages with pencil, not for anyone else to see, but to remind myself that I am still capable of noticing beauty and meaning. Sometimes, on good days, I walk to the library and sit in the reading room simply to feel surrounded by other human beings, though I rarely speak. There is an ache in being invisible, in realizing that one's presence or absence makes no difference to the rhythm of others' lives. The ache grows sharper whenever I think of my grandchildren. When they were little, I dreamed of being the grandfather who took them fishing or told them stories by the fireplace. But Daniel and Julia preferred to send them to camps, tutors, and friends' houses. I see them now only through photographs on social media, images of birthdays and vacations where I am absent, unmentioned, unneeded. They are almost adults now, strangers to me though they carry my blood. I live modestly on my pension and savings. Years of careful planning mean I am not in need. Yet Daniel often treats me as if my money were already his, as if I am merely the steward holding it until he collects it. He drops hints about nursing homes, about downsizing, about how difficult it is for older people to manage their affairs. Once, he even suggested that I give him power of attorney just in case something happens. I laughed it off, but the suggestion unsettled me. It made me wonder whether he sees me as a father at all, or merely as a future inheritance. I have always tried to be generous, paying for his college when scholarships fell short, helping with his first down payment, covering medical bills when his children were born. Each time I gave, I told myself it was love. But love, I realize now, should be recognized, not exploited. My generosity became expected, then invisible, and now it is resented whenever I hesitate. Despite all this, I still yearn for closeness. In the evenings, when the house darkens and the silence deepens, I sometimes catch myself rehearsing conversations with Daniel in my head, imagining what I would say if we ever spoke honestly. I imagine telling him that I am proud of him despite everything, that I only ever wanted to be included, that I am not as fragile as Julia paints me. Yet when the phone rings and it is his voice, my rehearsed words vanish, replaced by a nervous eagerness to please. I ask about his work, his children, his plans, and he answers in clipped sentences before making an excuse to hang up. Afterward I sit staring at the receiver, ashamed of myself for hoping. The truth is that I have become a man who exists quietly at the edges of his own family. I keep my house clean, I pay my bills on time, I maintain my health as best as age allows, but none of it seems to matter to them. To them I am already halfway gone, someone fading into irrelevance. And perhaps I would have continued to drift in this muted half-life if not for the death of my brother Charles, a man whose life could not have been more different from mine. He was bold, successful, wealthy, admired. Where I was patient and cautious, he was daring and ambitious. We were never close, but we respected one another. When he passed unexpectedly last winter, the news struck me harder than I anticipated, not because we shared daily contact, but because his death reminded me of my own shrinking time. Charles left behind a substantial estate, businesses and properties, far beyond anything I could imagine owning. When the family was notified that the will would be read at the end of the month, Daniel called me with an unusual urgency in his voice. It was not grief I heard from him, but calculation. That call marked the beginning of what would become the most painful and strangely liberating chapter of my life. The day of the phone call from Daniel is etched in my mind because of the peculiar mixture of formality and discomfort in his voice, as though he were reading from a prepared script rather than speaking to his own father. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of grey winter day when the sky seems like a heavy lid clamped over the earth, and I was dozing in my chair when the telephone rang. At first I thought it might be a neighbour or the pharmacy, but when I heard Daniel's tone, I immediately sat straighter. He did not ask how I was, nor did he speak of Margaret as he sometimes perfunctorily did to fill silence. Instead, he launched directly into the matter at hand, informing me that the attorney handling Charles's estate had scheduled a formal reading of the will for the following Friday morning at the law office downtown. He explained that beneficiaries and close relatives were expected to attend, and though his words were carefully chosen, the impatience underneath was unmistakable. He told me that he and Julia would drive me there, that it would look better if the family arrived together. And then, after a pause, came the part that has haunted me since. "Dad, please, when we're in that room, just don't say anything. Let me handle it. It's better that way." There was a silence between us after that sentence, the kind of silence where unspoken truths press against the edges of the call. I wanted to ask him why my presence needed to be mute, why he feared my voice in front of strangers, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I murmured something non-committal, a vague assurance that I understood, though I did not. He quickly thanked me, in the curt way one thanks a clerk at a store, and hung up, leaving me staring at the receiver with a slow-building flush of shame and anger. For hours afterward I sat in that chair, rehearsing the conversation I should have had, telling him that I was not senile, that my mind was clear, that I had every right to speak at my own brother's will reading. But when I imagined saying those things, I also imagined the look Daniel would give me, that mixture of irritation and embarrassment, as if I were exposing a weakness in front of others. That look had silenced me many times before. In the days leading up to the reading, I found myself pulled back into memories of Charles. Though our lives had diverged, I respected him. He was decisive, sharp, and sometimes ruthless in business, but beneath that steel was a loyalty to family that was not always visible, yet unmistakable when it mattered. He had helped me quietly after Margaret's death, sending me checks I never cashed, inviting me to his house, though I rarely went. He once told me, with that half-smile of his, that I had something he lacked, the patience to endure life's long stretches of disappointment. I never knew if it was meant as a compliment or a pitying remark, but I held on to it. And now he was gone, leaving behind not only wealth, but also the weight of expectation and suspicion that always follows money. I knew Daniel's mind well enough to understand that he was already calculating what portion might come to him, how it might ease his mortgage or fund his children's education. I also knew, though he had not said it aloud, that he saw me as an obstacle rather than a rightful participant. The morning of the reading, Julia insisted on picking me up early, and from the moment I entered their car I could sense the tension. She was dressed immaculately, her hair arranged in that severe style that seemed to frame her disapproval, and she greeted me with a polite but cold smile that did not reach her eyes. Daniel avoided small talk, focusing on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. I tried to lighten the mood by recalling a memory of Charles, a humorous one from our childhood involving a fishing trip gone wrong, but Julia quickly redirected the conversation to logistics, reminding Daniel where to park and what documents to bring. It was as if they were preparing for a business negotiation rather than a family gathering to honor a man's final words. The law office was an imposing building of dark stone, with polished floors and hushed corridors that seemed designed to amplify discomfort. We were led into a conference room where several other relatives were already seated. Charles's second wife, a woman much younger than he had been, 2 of his adult children from earlier marriages, and a handful of cousins. At the head of the table sat Mr. Whitcomb, the attorney, a tall man with silver hair and an expression of solemn efficiency. He greeted us each in turn, his voice steady and impersonal, and then invited us to sit. I took a chair midway down the table, but Julia gently steered me to the end, whispering that it would be less confusing. I obeyed without protest, though the sting of her words burned. As the proceedings began, Mr. Whitcomb opened a thick folder and began reading the provisions of the will. His tone was measured, almost monotonous, as he listed properties, accounts, and specific bequests. Each time a name was mentioned, eyes flickered, Breaths caught and emotions tightened, but overall the atmosphere remained controlled. When Daniel's name appeared, Julia squeezed his hand under the table, and I could see the satisfaction in her posture. They were to inherit a sizable portion of investments, a gesture that Charles had likely intended as practical support. But then, unexpectedly, my name emerged from the monotone recitation, and the attorney announced that Charles had left me not only a financial sum, but also a personal item. His old grandfather clock, a heavy, ornate piece that had stood in his study for decades. The room shifted subtly at that moment, as if people had forgotten I existed in this context and were startled to be reminded. I felt my throat tighten, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. But before I could even absorb the meaning, I noticed Daniel's reaction. He leaned back in his chair with a barely suppressed sigh, his eyes flicking to Julia in a silent exchange of annoyance. She responded with the faintest roll of her eyes, and I could almost hear the words she did not say. Pointless. Wasteful. He won't even know what to do with it. Their private disdain, conducted in gestures they assumed I would not notice, pierced me more deeply than any open insult. I realized then that Daniel had not warned me to stay silent out of nervousness or respect for the process, but out of fear that I might remind everyone present that I was still a man, still a participant, still someone who could speak truths, inconvenient for him. The attorney continued, but I barely heard. My thoughts swirled, caught between memory and humiliation. I remembered teaching Daniel to respect others, drilling into him the importance of fairness and honesty, and now here he was, dismissing me as if I were senile, as if my inheritance were an error to be corrected rather than a deliberate choice of my brother. My pulse quickened, and I felt a trembling in my hands, not from age but from anger I had suppressed for years. And yet I remained silent, my lips pressed together, because the habit of silence had become second nature. Only later would I understand that this moment, this spark of humiliation combined with sudden recognition, was the catalyst for everything that followed. It was the moment when my son's attempt to erase my voice lit the fire that would eventually force me to speak. When the attorney's voice finally quieted, and the air in the conference room settled into that uneasy stillness which follows the reading of a will, I expected at least a respectful pause, some space for reflection on Charles's generosity, or perhaps a few words of remembrance. Instead, murmurs erupted immediately, low voices overlapping, the shuffle of papers, the scratch of pens as some relatives calculated silently what their inheritance meant. Daniel leaned forward, whispering to Julia with a sharpness he did not bother to conceal, and though their words were low, I knew by the rhythm and tone that they were speaking about me. His hand moved in a dismissive gesture towards the papers listing my name, as though the entire matter of my inheritance were a clerical error, an unfortunate footnote to be ignored. Julia nodded with tight lips, her expression betraying the irritation she rarely bothered to mask. I sat very still, feeling the weight of that clock mentioned in the will, a piece of Charles's life entrusted to me, and wondered if anyone else at the table could see how deliberately I was being pushed to the margins, even in this moment meant to honor family. Mr. Whitcomb invited anyone with questions to speak, his professional voice calm, but his eyes scanning the room with caution, no doubt anticipating disputes, for money always stirs grievances. One of Charles's adult sons raised a polite inquiry about a property division, another cousin asked about a trust, and each was addressed in turn. All the while I remained silent, remembering Daniel's warning not to speak. Yet every time another relative looked in my direction, as if expecting me to add something, Daniel's posture grew tenser, his shoulders stiffening, his jaw tightening, until I realized that his greatest fear in that room was not losing money, but losing control over the narrative. I was supposed to be invisible, a harmless old man at the end of the table, nodding politely and then signing whatever paper was handed to me. The notion that I might raise my voice, assert my presence, contradicted the entire structure he and Julia had built around me for years. After the formal session ended, small groups formed in the hallway outside the conference room. People exchanged perfunctory condolences, though the talk was already turning to logistics and practicalities. Daniel guided me by the elbow, as if I were infirm, steering me away from the others and lowering his voice. "Dad," he said with that tight smile he uses when speaking through clenched teeth. "Thank you for not making things complicated in there." It went smoother this way. You understand, don't you? Everyone was under enough stress without confusion. I looked at him, studying the lines of his face, the small flecks of grey in his hair that reminded me of how much time had passed, and I felt the rising pressure of words I longed to speak. But then Julia stepped in with her usual efficiency, slipping herself between us, adding in a tone polished to sound kind but honed with condescension. "We'll help you handle the paperwork for your share, Leonard. It can be overwhelming, and you shouldn't worry about these things at your age. Just sign where Daniel tells you, and we'll take care of the rest." She placed a hand lightly on my arm, as if reassuring, but the pressure of her fingers was more like a restraint. I nodded without answering, because what could I say that would not ignite a scene in that public hallway? On the drive home, the silence between us grew thick, broken only by the car's hum and Julia's occasional remark about schedules and obligations. Daniel finally cleared his throat and said, almost casually, "The money Charles left you. It's generous, but honestly, Dad, it's better if you let me manage it. Investments can be complicated, and you don't really have use for large sums anymore. We can put it towards the kids' education, secure their future, and you'll have peace of mind knowing it's helping them." His words were carefully framed as kindness, but I heard beneath them the raw truth. To him, I was a vessel to be emptied, not a man to be respected. I wanted to respond, to remind him that the money was mine, that Charles had trusted me with it, but Julia interjected smoothly before I could speak, saying, "It would look so much better if the funds were handled together as a family, rather than scattered. It keeps things less confusing for everyone." There was that word again, confusing, wielded like a weapon, as if my mind were a cluttered attic, unfit for responsibility. I stared out the window, my reflection faint in the glass, and thought how easily they dismissed my existence in favor of convenience. That night I could not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the documents from the lawyer still unopened beside me, and let the bitterness rise unchecked. The humiliation at the law office replayed in my mind. Daniel's sigh, Julia's roll of eyes, the subtle maneuvering to keep me silent. I realized how long this pattern had been in place, years of small dismissals that had become a cage around me. Each time I stayed quiet to avoid conflict, I had given them more power until my silence had become their expectation. The inheritance was not about money at all. It was about whether I would continue to be erased, whether even my brother's last gesture toward me could be reinterpreted as a mistake to be corrected. And I felt, for the first time in a long while, a surge of anger that was not fleeting, but solid, a force pressing upward from my chest, demanding to be released. 2 days later, Daniel visited my house under the pretense of helping me organize. He arrived with a binder of financial documents and a pen, speaking briskly about transfers and accounts. He pointed to places for me to sign, his explanations vague and rushed, and when I hesitated, asking to read more carefully, his irritation broke through. "Dad, you don't need to analyze every line. Trust me. This is routine. You're making it more difficult than it needs to be." Julia, who had come along, sat across the table with her arms crossed, her gaze sharp, saying little but watching closely. I studied the page and noticed something odd. It was not a mere acknowledgement of inheritance, but a form assigning management rights to Daniel. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized I was one signature away from surrendering control of what little independence remained to me. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the pen on the table and pushed the papers back. "I'll think about it," I said. Daniel's face hardened, the practiced patience slipping. Julia leaned forward and, with a sweet smile that made her words more cutting, said, "Leonard, you don't want to risk confusion with these things. If you wait too long, it might get complicated legally. Better to do it while you're still clear." That pause before clear struck like a blade. I knew then that they were already preparing to paint me as incompetent, weaving a narrative of decline that would justify taking everything. That night, alone in my chair, I whispered aloud for the first time in years words of defiance. I am not confused. I am not gone. My voice sounded strange, rusty, but strong. I knew the escalation had begun, not in the form of open confrontation yet, but in the recognition that my silence was no longer protection, but surrender. What Daniel and Julia could not imagine was that their insistence on erasing me had pushed me to the edge, where speaking out became not a risk, but a necessity. And though I did not yet know when or how, I sensed that the moment was approaching when I would no longer remain quiet, when I would speak with the full weight of years behind me. And when I did, the world around me, especially my son, would freeze. The turning point came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a moment so small that, under different circumstances, it might have passed unnoticed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raw and cold, and I had agreed, against my better judgment, to join Daniel and Julia for dinner at their home. They had insisted that it was important for the family to stay united after Charles's death, though I suspected it was less about unity and more about ensuring that I remained within their line of sight, manageable and monitored. I sat at their long dining table, polished to a gleam, while Julia served plates of food with the brisk efficiency of someone checking tasks off a list. Conversation was strained, Daniel speaking mostly about his work, Julia about the children's school schedules, with little directed toward me except the occasional perfunctory question asked without interest in the answer. It was during dessert, a tart that Julia placed in front of me with the reminder not to eat too much sugar, that the subject of the inheritance resurfaced. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his voice measured, as though rehearsed, and said, "Dad, about Uncle Charles's bequest. We've been thinking about how best to allocate it. Julia has contacts with a financial advisor who could structure the funds so they're maximized. It makes sense for you to transfer it to us. That way we can ensure it's put to proper use. You won't have to worry about keeping track." I forced myself to chew slowly, buying time. But then Julia added, in that tone of false reassurance that always carried more sting than open insult, "It will give you peace of mind, Leonard. Money is a burden at your age. We don't want you confused or worse, taken advantage of by strangers." The word strangers hung in the air, bitterly ironic, because at that moment it struck me that I was the stranger at this table, in this family that should have been my anchor. I looked at the two of them, their calm certainty that what belonged to me should naturally pass to them without discussion, and for the first time I saw not just selfishness, but calculation. The same cold strategy that Charles had warned me about in others, but which I had never expected from my own blood. I set my fork down carefully, my hand trembling slightly, and said, "Charles left that money to me, not to you." The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like the room itself had frozen. Daniel's eyes narrowed, Julia's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. I had never contradicted them so directly before, and in that instant the balance shifted. Daniel recovered quickly, masking his anger with a strained laugh. "Of course it's yours, Dad. No one is saying otherwise." "But you don't understand how complex these things can be. Taxes, investments, paperwork. It's easy to make mistakes. We just want to help." His words sounded reasonable, but his eyes betrayed him, dark with irritation. Julia reached across the table and patted my hand, her touch deliberate, her smile thin. "We only want what's best for you, Leonard. You've always trusted Daniel. Why stop now?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge beneath it, as if she were daring me to resist. In that moment, I remembered Charles's grandfather clock, the one he had specifically left to me, and how during the reading Daniel had dismissed it with a sigh. Charles had not made mistakes in his life casually. Every choice he made was deliberate, calculated. He had chosen me for that clock, and for that portion of money, because he had known something that Daniel refused to see. That I was not as feeble or confused as they claimed, that my presence still mattered. The realization filled me with a quiet, unexpected strength. For years I had allowed myself to be silenced, believing that keeping the peace was worth more than asserting my dignity. But now I understood that silence was no longer peace. It was surrender. I withdrew my hand from Julia's touch, folded it in my lap, and said evenly, "I will decide how to handle what Charles left me. I will not be signing anything until I am ready, and I will not be handing control over to anyone else." The words left my mouth slowly, firmly, and in the heavy stillness that followed, I felt something inside me settle into place. Julia's expression hardened, her smile vanishing, while Daniel exhaled sharply, as though restraining an outburst. They exchanged a glance, one of those silent communications married couples perfect, and I knew in that instant that they were no longer merely irritated, they were planning. Later that night, back in the solitude of my home, I sat listening to the ticking of the kitchen clock and realized the stakes had changed. By speaking even that small refusal, I had broken the pattern, and they would not forgive it. I sensed they would redouble their efforts to control me, perhaps even try to prove me incapable. But I also knew that I had crossed a threshold. There would be no going back to silence, no return to invisibility. For the first time in years, I felt not diminished by age, but sharpened by it, as though the long accumulation of disappointments had crystallized into a kind of resolve. I understood then that the battle was no longer about money, but about whether I still had the right to stand as a man in my own life. And though fear whispered at the edges of my mind, a stronger voice rose above it, telling me that when the moment came to speak again, I would not remain silent. The days following that dinner unfolded with a strange heaviness, as though the very air in my house carried the residue of what had been spoken. I replayed the moment again and again, my refusal to hand over control, the flicker of alarm in Julia's eyes, the tightness in Daniel's jaw, and though a part of me felt quietly triumphant, another part was restless, uneasy, sensing that a line had been crossed and that my son and his wife would not simply let the matter rest. For years they had relied on my compliance, on my willingness to fade into the background, and my sudden assertion, small as it might have seemed, was enough to disrupt the pattern upon which their sense of authority had been built. I spent hours pacing through my rooms, touching familiar objects, looking at Margaret's framed photograph on the mantel, and whispering to her as if she could hear me. I told her I had finally spoken, that I had finally drawn a boundary, but I also admitted that I was afraid, not of losing money, but of losing what little respect still clung to the edges of my relationship with Daniel. It did not take long for their response to manifest. The following week Daniel arrived unannounced, his knock sharp against the door, his voice raised as he called my name before I even had time to rise from my chair. When I opened the door, he stepped inside without waiting, carrying a folder of documents and speaking with the brusque authority of a man who had already decided what would happen. Julia trailed behind him, her eyes scanning my living room with that habitual disapproval, as though every object were evidence of my incompetence. Daniel spread the papers across my table and began to explain, in the slow, deliberate tone one might use with a child, that these were the necessary forms to streamline the estate and avoid unnecessary confusion. He said the words smoothly, as though rehearsed, but there was a strain beneath his voice, a suppressed anger that trembled at the edges. I tried to interrupt, to ask questions, but he talked over me, pointing with his pen, circling sections of text, repeating the phrase, "Trust me," as if it were a spell meant to dissolve my resistance. When at last I managed to speak, telling him I would not sign without reading carefully and consulting my own adviser, his face flushed with irritation. He leaned back, his jaw clenched, and for a long moment he stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, an expression not of disappointment or frustration, but of something colder, something like contempt. Julia broke the silence by sighing heavily and saying, "Leonard, this is exactly what we were worried about. You're getting overwhelmed. It's not your fault. It happens at your age. But if you keep refusing to accept help, you're going to create a mess for everyone." She spoke softly, almost sweetly, yet every word was barbed, and the implication was clear. They had already begun crafting the story of my incapacity. I stood slowly, my hands trembling, though not from weakness but from the surge of emotion that threatened to spill out. "I am not overwhelmed," I said quietly. "I am not incapable." "I understand perfectly well what you are trying to do." My voice was calm, but the steel beneath it startled even me. Daniel's eyes narrowed further, and he muttered something under his breath before gathering the papers roughly and shoving them back into his folder. He left without another word, Julia offering me a parting glance that was equal parts pity and disdain. When the door closed behind them, I collapsed into my chair, my chest heaving, my body taut with the realization that the battle was now fully in motion. Over the next days, subtle signs of their campaign appeared. A neighbor mentioned that Julia had asked whether she had noticed me wandering the street late at night, which of course had never happened. At the pharmacy, the clerk asked if I needed assistance remembering my prescriptions, explaining that Daniel had called with concerns about me forgetting doses. Even the bank manager, a woman who had known me for years, hesitated when I came to deposit a check, politely asking if I had someone who helped me manage accounts. Each incident was small, deniable, but together they formed a pattern, and I understood that Daniel and Julia were laying the groundwork to paint me as confused, unreliable, perhaps even unfit to manage my own affairs. The final confirmation came one evening when the phone rang and I recognized Mr. Whitcomb's voice on the other end. He explained, delicately but firmly, that he had received inquiries about the possibility of appointing a conservator for me, inquiries which he could not ignore, but which he thought I should know about. My throat tightened as he spoke, my heart pounding with the recognition of how far they were willing to go. When I asked who had made such inquiries, he paused, then admitted that Daniel and Julia had expressed concerns about my clarity. I thanked him for telling me and hung up, sitting in the dim light of my kitchen, feeling as though the walls themselves had shifted inward. They were not merely trying to persuade me anymore, they were preparing to take from me the very right to make choices. It was in that moment that the second escalation truly crystallized. I realized with a clarity that burned that my own son was willing to sacrifice my dignity, my independence, and even my sanity in the eyes of others in order to secure money and control. I remembered every dismissal, every condescending remark, every time he had shushed me, or redirected me as though my thoughts were embarrassing, and I understood that this was not a sudden betrayal, but the culmination of years of erosion. I thought of Margaret, how she had always urged me to speak more firmly with him, how she had said, "Leonard, if you let him treat you like a child, he always will." I had believed kindness and patience would eventually be recognized for what they were. I had been wrong. I began keeping notes, recording dates and words, writing down every interaction in a notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer. I collected receipts, organized bank statements, and even visited a doctor on my own to request a cognitive evaluation, which I passed without difficulty. I told no one of these preparations, not even my few friends, because I knew that Daniel would not hesitate to twist any shared word into a weapon. My days became a careful balance of outward compliance and inward resistance, nodding politely when Julia called to check in, while quietly documenting her veiled remarks about my supposed forgetfulness. Each note I wrote, each page I filled, felt like a small reclamation of power, evidence against the narrative they were weaving. The true breaking point, however, arrived during a family gathering, arranged under the pretense of honoring Charles, but in truth orchestrated by Daniel and Julia to consolidate their position. They invited cousins, neighbors, even Charles's widow, and as we sat in the living room, Julia steered the conversation skillfully toward the topic of the challenges of caring for aging parents. With a sympathetic smile, she spoke of how difficult it was to watch a loved one decline, how heartbreaking it was when confusion set in, and how important it was to take responsible steps early. She did not name me directly, but her eyes flicked toward me often enough that no one could mistake her meaning. Laughter that was not laughter, pity disguised as sympathy, rippled around the room. I sat frozen, my teacup trembling in my hand, listening as my own son nodded gravely and spoke of how he was trying to do the right thing. That night, after the guests had gone, I confronted Daniel in his kitchen, my voice shaking, not with fear, but with fury. "You humiliated me," I said. "You spoke of me as though I were not in the room, as though I were already gone. You think because I am old that I am weak. But I remember everything, Daniel. I remember what you've done, and I will not let you take what your uncle entrusted to me." He stared at me in silence for a long moment, then laughed coldly. "Dad, you don't understand. This isn't about you. It's about protecting the family. You should be grateful we're willing to take on the burden." He turned away before I could answer, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, my body trembling but my resolve hardening like iron. When I returned home that night, I sat in the silence of my living room, the shadows long against the walls, and realized that the time for patience had ended. The escalation was no longer quiet maneuvers, but open warfare, and if I continued to remain reactive, I would lose everything. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel the full breadth of anger, not the fleeting irritations I had swallowed, but the deep, righteous fury of a man who had been dismissed, used, and betrayed by his own child. It was then that I understood the truth. If I wanted to keep my dignity, if I wanted even a shred of justice, I would have to prepare not just to resist, but to fight. The decisive moment arrived not in the quiet of my home or in the strained conversations with Daniel and Julia, but back in that same law office where everything had begun, the polished floors gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights, the long table, stretched like a battlefield awaiting combatants. Mr. Whitcomb had scheduled a follow-up session to finalize allocations and signatures, and though the gathering was smaller this time, consisting only of the principal heirs and their spouses, the tension in the room was palpable. I had prepared myself for this day with a determination I had not felt in years, bringing with me not only the documents I had meticulously organized, but also the inner conviction that silence was no longer an option. I knew Daniel would attempt to dominate the proceedings, to reduce me again to a passive figure in the corner, and I resolved that this time I would not allow it. The meeting began with the usual formalities, mister. Whitcomb reviewing provisions, explaining next steps, shuffling papers with that precise professionalism that seemed designed to keep emotions at bay. But beneath his measured voice, the undercurrent of hostility was unmistakable. Daniel sat upright beside Julia, his hands folded tightly, his gaze darting toward me with barely concealed impatience, while Julia herself radiated calm superiority, as though the outcome were already assured, and she was simply enduring the process until the inevitable transfer of control was complete. When Mr. Whitcomb finished his overview and asked if anyone had questions or statements before signatures were made, Daniel opened his mouth almost immediately, clearly intending to seize the floor before anyone else could speak, and it was in that precise instant that I felt the weight of years pressing behind me, the voice of Margaret whispering that it was time, the echo of Charles's trust reminding me of my worth, and before Daniel could utter a single word, I leaned forward and said clearly, "I would like to speak first." The effect was immediate and electric. The room stilled, Daniel's jaw snapping shut, Julia's eyebrows lifting in sharp surprise, and even Mr. Whitcomb paused mid-gesture, his pen hovering above the page. It was as though no one had expected me to claim a voice at all, let alone with such calm authority. My heart pounded, but my voice held steady as I began, speaking not with anger, but with the quiet gravity of truth. I said that for too long I had allowed myself to be silent, that I had mistaken compliance for peace, and that my brother's final gesture to me was not a mistake, but a deliberate acknowledgement that my life, my judgment, and my dignity still mattered. I spoke of the attempts that had been made in the weeks since his death to undermine me, the whispered doubts about my clarity, the suggestions that I was confused, the efforts to strip me of decision-making under the guise of protection. I did not shout, I did not accuse with wildness. Instead, I laid out facts, each one heavy and undeniable, and as I did, I saw Julia shift uneasily in her chair, while Daniel's face grew redder, his composure cracking at the edges. Then I revealed the preparations I had quietly made. I placed on the table copies of the medical evaluations I had requested, signed and stamped by 3 different specialists, each affirming my soundness of mind and body. I laid out my carefully kept notes of interactions, dates and quotations recorded in neat handwriting, evidence of the pattern of condescension and manipulation. And finally, I reminded everyone present that Charles had not chosen his heirs lightly. He had trusted Daniel with certain investments, yes, but he had also chosen me, his brother, for a reason that transcended money. Because he knew that despite my quiet nature, I was capable of seeing truth and carrying memory when others were blinded by greed. The silence after I finished was unlike any silence I had experienced before. It was not the silence of dismissal, the silence of being ignored, but the silence of a room forced to confront something undeniable. Mr. Whitcomb cleared his throat softly, and with deliberate care, said, "Mr. Atwood is entirely correct. His capacity has never been in question from our standpoint, and the documentation he has provided only confirms it further. His rights in this matter are fully his own, and any suggestion otherwise has no legal standing." His words, calm and official, landed like a gavel. Daniel made a sound halfway between a scoff and a protest, beginning to speak, but Julia touched his arm sharply, her eyes warning him that resistance would only deepen their humiliation. For the first time in years, I looked directly at my son without lowering my gaze. "Daniel?" I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. "I am your father. I raised you, I taught you, I stood by you. All I ever wanted was respect, not deference, not money, not control, just respect. And when you asked me to remain silent, when you tried to erase me, you forgot that respect cannot survive in silence. I will not be erased, not here, not anywhere." His lips tightened, his eyes blazing with fury, but he had no words, because the authority he had long wielded over me had evaporated in an instant. The room remained frozen in that charged stillness for what felt like minutes, though it was likely only seconds, until at last Mr. Whitcomb resumed his work, guiding us through the signatures with quiet efficiency. Yet everything had changed. No one looked at me with pity now. No one dismissed me as frail or confused. I had spoken first, and in doing so I had shattered the image Daniel and Julia had worked so carefully to construct. They sat stiff and silent for the remainder of the meeting, their anger palpable but contained, while I felt a profound calm settle over me, a calm not of surrender but of reclamation. As we rose to leave, Daniel muttered something about unfinished conversations, his voice low and tight, but I simply nodded and walked past him, my back straighter than it had been in years. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, the city street alive with noise and motion, yet around me there was a stillness, the stillness of a man who had finally claimed his voice. For so long I had feared that speaking would bring ruin, that it would sever the fragile thread that still connected me to my son. But in that moment I understood that silence had been the true ruin all along. By speaking first, I had not only defended my rights, but reclaimed the dignity that had been eroded piece by piece. And though I knew the conflict was not over, though I knew Daniel and Julia would continue to seethe and perhaps even plot further, I also knew that the balance had irrevocably shifted. The next move, whatever it was, would no longer be made in the shadows of my silence, but in the full light of a voice that had at last returned. When I returned home after that meeting, the house felt different, though nothing had changed in its rooms or its furniture. The silence that usually pressed against me like a suffocating blanket now seemed lighter, as if the very walls acknowledged that I had taken back something of myself that had been surrendered long ago. For years this place had been both a refuge and a prison, filled with memories of Margaret, but also haunted by the echo of my own passivity. And now, as I sat in my chair with the evening light slanting through the curtains, I realized that the silence no longer mocked me but respected me. I had spoken when it mattered most, and in doing so I had reclaimed not only my rights but also my sense of worth. In the days that followed, I heard very little from Daniel. There were no phone calls checking in, no sudden visits with papers in hand, no carefully orchestrated dinners where I was both present and invisible. Julia sent one message through email, short, perfunctory, cold, saying they would review matters in the future. But I knew what that meant. They were retreating to regroup, their humiliation too raw to allow them to face me directly. At first I feared the absence, fearing it signaled a final rupture, but soon I began to understand it for what it was, the absence of control. They could no longer dictate the narrative, and so they withdrew. And in that withdrawal I felt, perhaps for the first time in years, free. With that freedom came a clarity about what I wished to do. I had no desire to hoard the inheritance, to cling to the money as though it might substitute for the love and recognition I had long sought from my son. I understood now that Daniel's respect was not something money could purchase or secure, for it had been eroded not by poverty but by pride and greed. To continue seeking it would only prolong the wound. Instead, I thought of the students I had taught in those decades at the high school, the ones who had little but carried within them a hunger for knowledge and a light of potential. I remembered the boy whose parents worked 3 jobs and still could not afford college applications, the girl who borrowed library books in secret because she was embarrassed by how badly she wanted to learn. It was for them, I realized, that Charles' money could have meaning. So I contacted the local community foundation and began the process of establishing a scholarship in my brother's name, one that would help children from modest families pursue higher education. I decided to contribute not only the sum Charles had left me, but also a portion of my own savings, enough to ensure that the fund would continue beyond my lifetime. The process was slow, full of forms and meetings, but each signature I placed filled me with a sense of purpose that no act of compliance with Daniel ever had. For once my choices were my own, guided not by fear or expectation but by conviction. When the scholarship was finally announced in the local paper, with my name listed quietly as benefactor, I felt Margaret's presence in the room, her approval in the stillness, and for the first time since her death I smiled without bitterness. News of the scholarship reached Daniel eventually. He called me after weeks of silence, his voice tight with disbelief, asking why I had given the money away when it could have stayed in the family. I listened quietly as he spoke, his anger thinly veiled as concern, and when he finished, I answered, simply, "Respect was all I ever wanted from you, Daniel, not gratitude, not money. And when I saw I would not have it, I chose to give where it might grow into something good." There was a long pause on the line, then a muttered reply I could not catch before he hung up. I have not heard from him since, though I suspect he will call again when necessity forces him to, and if he does, I will answer, not with bitterness, but with the calm certainty of someone who no longer waits for recognition. Now my days are still quiet, the house still holds its shadows, but the silence is no longer heavy with shame. I read in the mornings, I walk in the afternoons, I write letters to the foundation offering encouragement for the young recipients whose names I do not yet know. Each tick of the kitchen clock reminds me of Charles's final gift, not just the money or the ornate clock in his study that now rests in mine, but the gift of awakening me to the truth that it is never too late to speak, never too late to refuse. Eresha. I think often of the moment in that law office when I claimed the floor before my son, when the room froze, and I realized that the real inheritance was not wealth, but dignity restored. Perhaps history will judge me as a quiet man who lived a modest life, a teacher whose name will be forgotten except in the margins of old yearbooks and the faded memories of students. But I know, in the marrow of my bones, that in those final chapters I did not remain silent, and when my own time comes, when my voice is stilled at last, I will leave behind not just the memory of who I was, but the example that silence is not peace, that dignity is worth defending even in the winter of life. My son may never forgive me, he may never understand, but I have forgiven myself for waiting so long, and in that forgiveness I have found something greater than respect. I have found peace.